famous and prominent Americans have been Freemasons. Franklin Roosevelt, Hugo Black, Harry Truman, Lyndon Johnson, Gerald Ford, just to name a few. However, the Catholic Church has consistently condemned Freemasonry from 1738 until 1960. In fact, on May 14, 1829, Pope Pius VIII, in his encyclical Traditi Humilitate, condemned Masonry as follows, quote, "Their law is untruth, their God is the devil, and their cult is turpitude." I'm Julius Smetona. This is what Catholics believe. Joining with me to discuss Freemasonry is Mr. Paul Fisher. Mr. Fisher is a graduate of Notre Dame University. He subsequently attended the School of Foreign Service at Georgetown University. He served in an intelligence capacity with the U.S. Army both in World War II and during the Korean War. And he served in security for a number of governmental organizations, including the National Association, the NASA. And finally, he was the Congressional Aide for Congressman Jim Delaney for 8 years. Mr. Fisher is also the author of the book Behind the Lodge Door, as well as Their God is the Devil. Also with me is Father Clarence Kelly. Father Clarence Kelly is Superior of the Society of St. Pius V. In addition, he is the spiritual director of St. Joseph's Novitiate, a congregation of traditional Catholic sisters in Round Top, New York. Father Kelly also has written a book in which the question of Masonry is discussed at length, Conspiracy Against God and Man. Mr. Fisher, welcome to What Catholics Believe.
Thank you very much. Nice being here.
Mr. Fisher, I have a question. You know, when one hears this condemnation of Masonry in such strong and to our ears almost fanatical language, it seems almost incongruous when I think the public perception of Masons are people who support and promote hospitals for crippled children. They promote very benevolent and social functions and the circus and so on and so forth. You read this seems almost crazy.
Well, I hope it isn't fanatical. I think everything's backed up by documents largely from Masons themselves. It is true that the average Mason, the great majority of Masons, don't know what Freemasonry is all about. In fact, the grand philosopher of Freemasonry, Albert Pike, said that the blue degrees, that's the first 3 degrees of Masonry, think they know what Masonry is, but they don't. Real knowledge of Masonry only comes to the princes of Masonry, which you get up to the 30th degree and above. So the average guy thinks it's, in fact, I believed that it was nice. I saw a nice parade they had, and I said, I don't care what the church says about it. I knew vaguely what it was, and the church opposed it. I said, these men are bringing a lot of happiness to all these children. Later I found out that that's a scam. The hospitals and the parades are just to lure men in because people want to be identified with an organization that does so many good things, but they don't know what they're joining.
Why is there antagonism then? Why does the church condemn Freemasonry? What does it find offensive or objectionable in it?
Well, the church attacked Freemasonry within 25 years after it was founded because of its naturalism. And naturalism is that the only reality is nature. There is no God in the sky or in heaven or whatever. And one of the grand secrets of Masonry is that man himself is God. Man is the great architect who will change the world.
Is it true to say that Masonry is actually a religious system, a system of belief?
Oh, absolutely. They have everything the Catholic Church has. They have baptisms, they have funerals, they have what they call sacraments, they have rituals, and they admit to being the successors, the modern-day successors to the pagan ancient mysteries. It is a religion.
I was told by an IRS agent that they have the status of a church as far as federal exemption goes. They are recognized as a church.
Father Kelly, my understanding is that if you look through the consistent papal encyclicals dealing with Freemasonry, there's 4 reasons why the church condemns them. The oaths they take, the secrecy, the religious indifferentism, meaning one religion is as good as the other. In fact, theirs might even be better. And then there's subversion against the church and state. What's wrong with the oaths they take, the Masons take?
They take an oath of blind obedience so that they commit themselves to following the orders of their superiors. Now, again, as Mr. Fisher said, the overwhelming majority of Blue Lodge Masons are really not aware of what's going on, but if you get into the inner circles, they submit themselves heart and soul, at least that's the idea, to the commands of their superiors. And that type of blind obedience is potentially very dangerous. It could be a license for the commission of any crime. But Pope Leo XIII, who wrote a wonderful encyclical on Freemasonry, he put it into a very big context. He said that from the beginning of time, there's been a war between the forces of good and the forces of evil, between what St. Augustine called the city of God and the city of man. And that the leader, the ruler, the force behind the city of man is Satan, and the force behind the city of God, of course, is our Lord Jesus Christ, the Son of God and the Savior of the world. And he says in there that in our times, the forces of hell, the forces of Satan, have organized in a most extraordinary way, and that this is essentially the role of Freemasonry, to take up this grand cause against God and against his holy church, and to establish, in effect, a new world order which is based upon pure naturalism.
Mr. Fisher, could you give me one concrete example of Masonic hostility to the Catholic Church?
Oh, they admit through the years that they're hostile to the Church, particularly in Europe. And a lot of people think the European Masonry is different than Masonry in the United States. Well, in Europe, they were fighting the Roman Catholic Church as such. That was Christianity largely in Europe that they opposed. But in the United States, they have been behind the Know Nothing movement. It's documented in my book. The Know Nothing movement, the APA movement,
what is the APA movement?
APA was it had two titles. One was the American Protestant Association was one title. The other was the American Protective Association, which means protect the country from Catholics. And the Ku Klux Klan, all the leaders of the Ku Klux Klan, the top leaders were Masons, and only Masons could be what they called Kliegels, that is, go out and solicit for membership in it. While we hear a lot about the Klan, this is the Klan from 1921 forwards for 1928, that it was anti-black. The Klan at the Civil War very definitely was, but the Klan in 1921 forward, the mother lode for the antipathy and the tremendous joining of people all over the country in places like Connecticut and Massachusetts and New York and some where there weren't a lot of blacks at the time, is the Catholic Church, hatred of the Catholic Church. And there was little hatred of Jews in the Klan. The whole focus was against the Catholic Church. And the Klan went under for two reasons. One reason was that the state of New York passed legislation after court opinion that they'd have to register all their members and their dues and their financial report to the state. That law is still on the books. The Masons were able to, in conjunction with the Knights of Columbus, to have themselves exempted for it, and yet it was a front for Masonry. And they got around it. The other thing was the Depression, which did it in.
I can remember reading your book that, first of all, it's very interesting that the Scottish Rite of the Southern Jurisdiction, their official magazine is called The New Age. Now, maybe the name changed, but certainly from 1920 to maybe very recently it was called The New Age. I recall that during the 1950s, they said we have much more to fear from the Catholics than from the Soviets. Now, this is really striking because the 1950s was the big scare, you know, the House Committee on American Activities and so forth. Do you think this is a fair view, that the Masons were very much afraid of this becoming a Catholic country, of having a Catholic president, and so on?
Oh, clearly. They many quotations in the book about opposing anything Catholic. I think the first major candidate they attacked, well, of course, Al Smith. They were against Al Smith.
In the 1920s when he ran. 1920s. Governor of New York.
Governor of New York. And the thing about Al Smith, people forget, but Jack Kennedy, or actually John... his campaign manager from Connecticut, whose last name escapes me, did a study and showed there was such a thing as a Catholic vote, because in the two preceding elections for president prior to Al Smith, the Republicans really wiped them out. But Al Smith got almost twice the number of votes as the two preceding Democratic candidates. So that proved there was such a thing as a Catholic vote. And Jack Kennedy rode into the White House on such a vote. So that there's another figure in the book, I think, between 1955 and 1960, 56% of the total growth in the United States was in the Catholic sector. And right after that is when we had Vatican II and the whole dissipation of the church. At that time, too, you may recall, nothing to do with Masonry particularly, but the American Management Association put out a study showing the Catholic Church was the best organized and efficient organization in the world over General Motors or any other group. And with that, it went down the tubes, and the Catholic population declined, and the rate of growth is just infinitesimal since that time.
I'd like to get back to that question, but
I would like to respond to your question about attacks on the Catholic Church. If you, for example, look at the Italian Revolution, Garibaldi was a Mason. They bitterly persecuted the Catholic Church and hated it with great intensity. The French Revolution, to a great extent, was a Masonic enterprise, even though during the course of the Revolution itself, the general lodges were suppressed. Nevertheless, the ones who ran the government, who came to power, they were Masons, and their supreme goal was the utter ruination of everything Catholic, to destroy. And they did ruthlessly and brutally murder countless priests and nuns and lay people. There was one that even had a program for the depopulation of France, where they conceived of the possibility of solving unemployment by killing 1/3 of the French population.
It's incredible. You know, let's turn our gaze onto the United States. You kind of alluded to my earlier question I have in mind. There's a general perception amongst some who are fearful of Masonry that would say, well, yes, European Masonry is somewhat malignant. But certainly that's not the case in the United States. Let's turn our gaze in the United States in the 19th century.
That's why I started to say, and I didn't articulate it well, was that their known opponent in Europe was the Roman Catholic Church. In the United States, it was general Christianity, but they knew that the Protestant and the Catholic, you had a division right there. So they got Protestants in the United States, by and large, to work up this hatred against the Catholic Church. And the No More Nothing movement, one of the famous riots was the Philadelphia riots of 1840, something like 1846, 48, where actually during that riot they lined up a cannon in front of the Catholic Church, St. Philip's, and fired the cannon right into the front door of the church. And they insisted they had to investigate churches because they were hiding weapons in the basement of the churches. A famous columnist, a well-known columnist, who was writing well into the 60s, I believe, Lowell Mellett, did a piece in The Nation magazine in which he supported that idea. He was talking about the Klan, and he was the one who talked about there wasn't much mileage among the blacks or the Jews. The mileage was in the hatred of the Catholic Church. And he indeed endorsed it. Here's a major columnist. He endorsed that idea of not attacking the Masons for what they were doing in the Catholic Church, but they were right. We should go into the basements of every church in the United States and see if they have guns.
There's an idea that they were circulating that they were training an armed force to take over this country militarily, you know, under the Pope's command. You're watching What Catholics Believe. We're discussing Freemasonry. Mr. Fisher, the main point I'd like to get to is the profound social change which took place in the United States during the 1930s and 40s, and we feel its effect today, namely the whole church-state question. You dealt with the fact in your book that on 3 separate occasions, at least, the United States Supreme Court declared that the United States is a Christian nation, all right? During the 19th century, it was not unusual for the federal government to give money to churches, even the Catholic Church, to help establish schools, to help establish missions. This was not unusual. Prayer in school was almost a norm. Bible reading was the norm. Then all of this changed. Perhaps you could just tell us a little about the religious spirit in this country in the 19th century, and then get us into the 1930s with Hugo Black and Franklin Roosevelt and the court-packing scheme.
Well, the Christian religion in this country was accepted as being the established church. And when they say that when the Constitution was adopted, a wall was erected separating church and state, was totally wrong. Immediately after the First Amendment was approved, one of the first acts they did was appointed chaplains to the Congress, the House and the Senate. James Madison, whom they give credit for writing the First Amendment, which he did not, was in the Congress. He was shown on the quorum calls as being present. He did not object to it. He later admitted he was present when this happened. But almost immediately afterward, there was three major acts passed by Congress to give funding to the Indians, to convert the heathen Indians, I think it was worded, to Christianity. There was another legislation which was prior to the Congress being established. It was the Continental Congress we're operating under. But in the new Congress, the Northwest Ordinance provided, funds shall be provided for schools to teach morality, because you just can't operate a government without having sound moral principles based on Christianity. And President proclamations about Thanksgiving have gone all through the history of our country. George Washington's farewell address said, we fool ourselves if we think we can have morality without religion. You had inaugural addresses of the presidents, almost without exception, with one exception would be Thomas Jefferson, mentioned Almighty God, or Jesus 3 times. Christianity was indicated by the presidents in their inaugural addresses as being the religion of the United States. Abraham Lincoln was the one, William Henry Harrison, John Adams, all mentioned, but all of them mentioned Almighty and so forth. So Christianity was generally pervaded the country, and certainly not the Catholic religion, but largely general Protestantism was effective. One of the famous jurists was Justice Story, appointed to the Supreme Court by Mr. Madison. And he clearly said that Christianity is what's intended to be protected by the First Amendment. So he had a whole range of history behind this being a Christian nation. Then in the 1940, the court became dominated by Freemasons in ratios of 8 to 1, 5 to 4 to 8 to 1, up through 1941 through 1971, a 30-year period when the Masons sat on the court.
Why don't you explain to us their attitude toward education? I understand that they couldn't stand the idea of giving tuition credits to Catholics so they could attend parochial schools, and they wanted to make sure that public education, in their words, was non-sectarian and was devoid of any relationship to God or religion.
Well, you see, up until pretty much the GI Bill of Rights following World War II, actually during 1944 it passed, education was a state matter. The federal government got into it with the GI Bill of Rights. And when the GI Bill of Rights was on the floor of the House, 85% of both the House and the Senate are lawyers. Not one raised the question about this being contrary to the Constitution. Indeed, Senator Morse, Wayne Morse of a western state, Oregon? Oregon, yes, right. He was dean of the law school of Oregon, law school. He did not raise a question. The specific question was asked on the House floor, well, supposing one of these returning veterans wants to attend a seminary, a religious seminary, was that covered by the legislation before us? They said, yes, as long as the seminary is legitimate, not a fly-by-night organization. So that legislation passed, and indeed returning veterans did go to seminaries, became priests and ministers and rabbis. The following year, other legislation came to the floor, and it was designed along the lines of the GI Bill. Now, state constitutions have prohibitions on giving any aid to parochial school, religious institutions. The GI Bill allowed for the Administrator of Veterans Affairs to override that and authorize it through the federal government so the money would go to them. So many kids went to Catholic schools and seminaries. The second legislation for elementary and secondary students originally came in for public school students only. Then 2 senators introduced a companion bill to include Catholic and other religious schools involved in it. This is what the Masons got upset about. They are for public education. Indeed, they helped found public education in the United States, but they didn't want any aid to go to Catholic schools. The legislation was somewhat in limbo. And Justice Black, a sitting justice, a Mason, on the court in 1945.
Violently anti-Catholic, too.
Oh, militant.
And a Ku Klux Klan member, formerly.
And was a Ku Klux Klan, not anti, he was a lifetime member,
right.
You're right. Man received a Pulitzer Prize for revealing that about Justice Black. Justice Black left the country, and when he came back, he didn't deny he'd been a Klansman or didn't say anything about the Klan. He immediately attacked the religious bigotry in the country who were trying to stir up religious animosity. And the reason I mention that is because as recently as last June, the court handed down an opinion in which they were concerned about religious animosity endangering the country should you give any aid to parochial schools. There is no record of religious animosity except for the Masonic-dominated Know-Nothing, Ku Klux Klan, APA movements. There has been clear animosity when you had open housing and things like that. The riots did indeed break out, but the court never concerned us. It's only this religious aspect, and what they're talking about is the Catholic school system because it's the largest, but any religious school system, because the only religion Masonry wants is their own religion. So that Justice Black sent a letter to Lister Hill, and Lister Hill was the senator who succeeded Black in Alabama when Black went to the Supreme Court, for which he was unqualified. But he sent this letter urging him to get in touch with the Masons because the Masons are opposing the bill. Well, the Masons were really not opposing the bill generally because they want public school to flourish. They were opposing that portion of the bill which would have also aided parochial schools, Catholic parochial schools, Jewish, Lutheran, whatever, religious parochial schools. That's what they strongly opposed. And so here's a sitting justice lobbying a senator. Now, I guess a justice is a citizen like anybody else, but he not only wrote to his own senator, he also wrote to the head of the Masonry, the Scottish Rite Masonry in Washington, and to the Scottish Rite Masonry in Alabama, urging them to look carefully at this bill.
Let's talk about some of the other things that happened. In 1922, I understand, the state of Oregon passed a law which made it compulsory for every child to attend a state school. Isn't that the case?
That's right.
Who was responsible for that law?
The Masons. The Masons pushed it through. In fact, they tried to push one through within the last couple of years. But it was destroyed on its prima facie because there had been this Somebody's versus Society of Sisters, I forget the exact title of it. That was the key decision, where it says that the basic thrust of the court's opinion then was the child does not belong to the state. He belongs to the parents, and they could educate that child in whatever manner they want.
How is this? Here we have a secret society, which what it is, an ancient secret society, which has such power that presidents of the United States to curry favor join it, that they have a tremendous influence over the Supreme Court, they have a tremendous impact on Congress, and yet there's nothing about it in the newspapers. There's no investigation into the influence of this secret society. How do you explain that?
They have 4 million members, too.
It's got 4 million members. They're very prominent. You've mentioned some of the prominent ones. One you missed was Ronald Reagan came in 1988.
Is it because of their power?
It's done because of their power, because a lot of the press are members of the of Masonry. And it's always put off aside, oh, it's the kook fringe talking about secret societies and conspiracies. Clearly, it is a conspiratorial organization. The fact that it has secrets and these terrible oaths that you get your throat cut across, your bowels torn from out if you violate any secret that they learn in the lodge door or otherwise within Masonry. So even these good and decent men, one of the presidents of the Philippines, the grand commander of Scottish Rite Masonry reported in the New Age magazine that, I think it was Manuel Quezon, I wouldn't be held at that, but it's either he or another one, would not join the 33rd degree of Masonry because he's afraid he would have to do something against his government, which he was not prepared to do. So these people, when you get up to the 30th degree, you're pretty well aware of what's happening.
What's going on?
Just very briefly before we have to go, that particular Supreme Court was also responsible for all kinds of laws, you know, breaking the anti-blasphemy concepts.
Oh, yeah. It changed the whole orientation. That's kind of the whole Christian orientation is kind of just destroyed.
As a result of Masonry.
By Masonry.
Right.
You've been watching What Catholics Believe. discussed last week, many famous Americans were or are Freemasons. Franklin Roosevelt, Earl Warren, Hugo Black, Harry Truman, Lyndon Johnson, Gerald Ford, even Ronald Reagan. And yet there exists a tremendous enmity between Freemasonry and the Catholic Church. The Catholic Church has condemned solemnly Freemasonry from 1738 until 1960. Pope Pius VIII in 1829 wrote that their God is the devil and their cult is turpitude. But on the same hand, Freemasons have clearly stated their antagonism to the Roman Catholic Church. In the American Freemason, we can read as follows: "This magazine has never swerved from the position that between the Masonic fraternity and the Catholic Church there is an antagonism inherent in the nature of the organizations. The one seeking broadest liberty of thought and the other trying to stifle all revolt against this authority. We have declared that there can be no true peace nor even truce between Freemasonry and the official Roman Church. They are opposing poles of thought." I'm Julius Smetona. This is When Catholics Believe. I'd like to welcome my guests back again, Mr. Paul Fisher, publisher, editorialist, and writer. He was the author of Behind the Lodge Door, an expose of American Freemasonry, and Their God is the Devil. Also with me is Father Clarence Kelly, Superior of the Society of St. Pius V and Spiritual Director of St. Joseph's Novitiate in Round Top, New York, a congregation of traditional Catholic sisters. Father Kelly is also an author. He wrote Conspiracy Against God and Man, which deals extensively with European Masonry. You know, last time we were getting into the question of Franklin Roosevelt's court-packing scheme, which supposedly was frustrated, but in reality was not, in that he eventually had 8 Freemasons who were on the Supreme Court and who probably effected the most profound social change in this country's history. We had a country which in the 19th century at least 3 separate occasions was declared to be a Christian nation by the Supreme Court. We had a country in which abortion was illegal, adultery was illegal, it was illegal to transport birth control devices through the mail. Margaret Sanger in the 1920s was arrested, the head of the foundress of Planned Parenthood, for advocating birth control devices. Blasphemy was illegal. Prayer in schools was not uncommon. Government aid to official religions was not uncommon. And yet, we are now living in a world which is largely the creature of 8 men who legalized abortion, have tolerated blasphemy, and so on. Mr. Fisher, how have the Masons been responsible for this?
Well, about the 8 men, this has fluctuated from 5 to 4 to 8 to 1. 8 to 1 may have lasted for a term or two, but until 1971 they still dominated the courts in that ratio. Sometimes it may have been 7 to 2, and so forth. They struck down, the key one was the Everett decision of 47, which brought in this idea of a wall of separation. Nothing could be further from the truth. There was no wall of separation. And all precedent court opinion prior to that time was encouraging Christianity in this country. Those 4 decisions, you said 3, there are actually 4 decisions which the court has said this is a Christian nation. Presidents have said it. I mentioned John Adams and Abraham Lincoln and William Henry Harrison in their inaugural addresses identify the United States as a Christian nation. The Masons are viscerally opposed to Christian religion, particularly the Catholic Church, but fundamentally to all religions which believe in a supreme being. To them, the supreme being is man. They're completely naturalists, they're Gnostics, they boast about being Kabbalistic Gnostics. At any rate, we had this whole Christian aura to the country. Kids had Bible reading in public schools. You had the prayer in public school. The court knocked that out. I did a little research on the FBI's statistics of crime. I took it from the time that the FBI organized their statistics, which was a 30-year period, and for the 10-year period subsequent to knocking Bible reading and prayer in school out. And the violent crimes from just 10-year period were something like 3 or 4 times larger than they were in the entire 30-year prior to those statistics by the FBI. And that was when people believed in God. Once you knock God out of the equation, you have no fear of anybody. You don't fear the president, you don't fear your parents, you don't fear your superiors or anything else. And that's what's happened to this country. And not only was it the prayer and the Bible reading and bus rides, but it was also these same courts knocked out blasphemy laws. You can look at all the laws, the civil laws in the country, both at federal and at state level, and you can get the 10 Commandments. All the civil laws were upholding the 10 Commandments. Thou shalt not steal, honor thy father and thy mother, keep holy the Sabbath day. Remember the Sabbath laws? The stores were closed on Sundays.
Right.
They knocked that out. That
I'm not that old. I can still remember when.
Well, you've heard of it.
Yeah,
You've seen movies of it.
I've seen it myself. You didn't do it on Sundays. It was peaceful on Sundays.
So all of these things have been knocked out by the Supreme Court. So consequently, the court establishes the moral tone of the nation. If the court says Christianity is out, you can blaspheme Christ, you don't have to admit he's the Redeemer, you can blaspheme the God of the Jews, man is supreme, and that's what we're getting. So people are groping. Parents are concerned frequently about their kids going off with Moonies and other religious organizations.
Moonies, what about the devil worshippers?
Well, the whole thing, there's an outreach for God, for some supreme being, for something to hang on to. They know it's not in this world. When a guy's falling out of an airplane, he doesn't say, "Oh, Julius, save me." He says, "Oh, God, help me." Even though he's an atheist, he's going to shout for God. But they're looking. But the court is trying to get that out of their mind. And that's how the New Age movement came in, with this whole thing of the court. For a 30-year period, they established, and it's important to keep in mind, that in jurisprudence, once a decision is established, they call it stare decisis. A similar case comes before the court, any court, they rely on a precedent opinion. So here you had the court establishment 30 years of precedent opinions. To this very day, as of last June, the court is still citing this Everson decision in 1947 and this idea that we must fear giving any aid to parochial schools. Just the other day, a federal court decided it does not violate the Constitution to allow the Ku Klux Klan to march, even though the possibility of riot may be there. Unless the riot takes place, the state cannot intervene, and that's kind of freedom of speech. But teaching God in school, there's a terrible danger that the country is going to be turned over. And they're selling this. These are guys, modern man is saying that God is dangerous to civilization.
Or saying a prayer at a graduation. The Supreme Court has forbidden that just recently.
That was the case. That was the case when they brought it in 47.
It's interesting. Right. We mentioned, yes, Father, go ahead.
I think, though, to put it in the proper context, people are probably wondering, well, why are they doing this? Why would these rulers of Masonry be seeking the annihilation of Christianity and specifically the destruction of the Catholic Church? And is that really true? And, you know, are these a couple of quacks who are identifying this relatively benign and benevolent institution as some force for evil? And the answer is, you can tell by the response of the popes. If you read the encyclical of Leo XIII on Masonry, Leo XIII was not a kook or a quack or a right-winged extremist. Leo XIII was very brilliant, very fine, educated, and a wonderful pope. Leo XIII wrote a wonderful encyclical. It's, even from a literary point of view, it's a masterpiece. But Leo XIII makes it very plain what Masonry is. Masonry simply is. It is the modern version of the devil's assault upon God and upon the Church. And what distinguishes Masonry from the efforts that have gone on in the past is that the devil has organized men in a very fine way. The power of Masonry is not only that it is a conspiracy directed by evil men, but that it is a conspiracy directed by evil men who are in our day and age carrying on the fight against the kingdom of God. It has to be put in that context to understand that it's not just a question of a few men or a small sect of people who are liberals. It has to be put in that bigger context, I believe, to really grasp why it is they are so absolutely dedicated to the establishment of this new arrangement which excludes God, which excludes our Lord.
To amplify what Father Kelly said, Mr. Fisher, perhaps you could describe part of the initiation oath for into the 30th degree of Freemasonry. What takes place? What is said?
Well, they're also all along about cutting your throat and ripping your heart out and so forth, which is a terrible intimidation of the guy to not release any secrets. But anyway, when you get to the 30th, the Knight Kadash degree, the candidate comes into the room and there are 3 skulls on the table. One skull has a crown on it, another skull has the papal tiara, and the third skull has a laurel wreath. So the candidate is led to the first crown, or the papal tiara, and he recites the word, "Down with imposture, down with tyranny." With that, he takes a poignard and he stabs the crown, the tiara on the crown.
The Pope's
tiara.
They hate the idea that someone can claim your conscience or can dictate what you must believe. And this
someone who represents God on earth.
That's right. They can't stand the idea of authority.
Well, that's it. Then the second, it does the same thing to the crown, which is the state. This is church and state. That's a symbolism. That's not only that Philip the Fair, which it's to represent, and Pope Clement XII. And then he does the same thing to the crown, which is the state. In this case, it was Philip the Fair. And then the third is the laurel wreath. Well, that's Jacques de Molay, and that's mankind. And he bows down and praises mankind. And that goes back just quickly to the trial, which was held over a period of 7 years. All sorts of witnesses were brought. There was some torture involved in some of the confessions, but those people, some
You're talking about the Knights Templar in the 1300s.
In the 13th century, and it was destroyed just because the Knights Templar were accused, and there was substantial evidence that they were committed homosexual acts, they urinated on the crucifix, and a lot of terrible things like that, which the people of the day were just appalled at. And so they read this in Latin when the charges are made, and then the whoever headed up the court said, "Now, would you like this translated in the vernacular," which had been in French. Said, "No, we don't want to hear all that," because they were just terribly embarrassed and shocked about what these accusations were against them. At any rate, de Molay was burned at the stake for this, and de Molay promised that the Pope and the King would die within a year or something. Well, one of them did. I forget whether it was the Pope. The Pope was 6. I think it was the Pope that did the King didn't. It was several years later that he died. But at any rate, that's how much they hate the church. The key is, it goes back really to the Garden of Eden. They say, they admit they're Kabbalistic Gnostics. Gnosticism, man will be saved by knowledge. And back in the Garden of Eden, remember, they ate the so-called forbidden fruit, and God indicating the Trinity way back in the Old Testament, which is in the Pentateuch too. That they will be as us. They want to be gods, the plural, the Trinity concept. And so that's what it is. Man wants to be God, and that's what Masonry can't stand. If you're concerned about life hereafter, they consider you're not going to be concerned about the welfare of the nation, and you're not going to be concerned about the poor out on the streets. Nobody's done more through the centuries to help the poor in the streets. Mother Teresa is a modern example than the Roman Catholic Church. And indeed, all churches have helped the poor and the destitute with their kitchens, their hospitals. Hospitals, the whole idea. Education is a Catholic idea. The idea of the hospitals is tremendous in the Catholic Church. And they are concerned about the welfare of the here and now, but they realize that this world is not the end. Masons don't like that attitude.
You're watching What Catholics Believe. We're discussing.
I'd like to just add, with regard to the Masonic ideology and this attack upon the crown and the tiara, the reality of the situation is that all authority comes from God, and that all legitimate civil rulers receive their authority from God. You may have a different mechanism to select the person who will occupy the office, but essentially that authority comes from God. And so it is also in the church, that authority is conferred by Almighty God upon a legitimate Roman pontiff and upon the bishops and so forth and so on. But this attack upon the tiara and the attack upon legitimate civil authority, which are Masonic ideals, are also communist principles. See, communists are anarchists, essentially. They believe that all government authority is intrinsically evil, and that the ultimate goal is the destruction of all legitimate civil authority. And they say the mechanism of doing this is to assume the dictatorship of the proletariat, that they would assume this this great dictatorial authority, but the purpose of the assumption of that dictatorial authority is to destroy all legitimate governments. And then when you destroy all legitimate governments and you destroy all religions, then man will be returned to the natural state. He will not be corrupted or spoiled or destroyed either by religion or by government or by family or by private property. And these ideals of communism are actually products of, to a great extent and for the most part, of Freemasonry. And Leo XIII points that out in his encyclical on Freemasonry.
Clearly so. That's James Billington, the present Librarian of Congress, wrote a book, Fire in the Minds of Men, which he said that not enough credit is given to the revolutionary movement originated in the lodges. So if you want to understand the revolutionary movement, because Masonic philosophy and dogma is communist. That's exactly what it is. In the French society, there was a phrase, there are no enemies to the left. They've always supported the left. They established the government in Spain. That's why all this anti-Franco...
During the 1930s, during the Spanish Revolution, and Mexico. Sure.
That was all communist. And communism is the same way in Fatima when Our Lady appeared.
That's right.
Was a communist and Masons behind the whole thing.
And that Masonic government in Mexico instituted a bloody persecution against the Catholic Church.
Absolutely. You know, we were talking about the Masonry, primarily their ideas in the United States. The interesting thing which has happened, I'd say, in the last, say, 30 years has been the changing attitude of the post-Vatican II Church to Masonry. Previously, the penalty for a Catholic joining the Masons was automatic excommunication, and he can only be reinstated by the Pope himself unless he was on the verge of death. Now we're faced with a situation where in the new Code of Canon Law, nothing about that is said at all, and implicitly by Cardinal Sapir, it is one is led to believe that Catholics may join the Masons, and in fact Catholic bishops and priests and laity have been joining the Masons in large numbers, and some bishops in fact have received citations from Masons that they exemplify Masonic thought. What are your feelings about this?
Well, that's true, and I think in the book I point out that the Masons were active at pre-Vatican II. The thing was getting organized, and the Grand Commander noted that we have people present there. And so they got largely what they wanted out of the... somebody accused Archbishop Lefebvre of saying that it's influenced by Masonry. And he's a Dominican, he's in the Vatican today, I can't think of his name, he's a Frenchman. And he said, doesn't the Archbishop know that's what the Vatican II is all about? Liberty, equality, fraternity. And that concept is in the document. Is it freedom of religion? Is that the, I forgot the title.
It's the dignity of man, dignitas humanae.
The
Yes.
documents of... Yeah.
But I would say this, that as communism and socialism might be looked upon as the secular and political arm of Masonry, you can look upon modernism as the theological arm of Masonry in this sense. One of the fundamental principles of modernism is naturalism and pantheism.
Maybe you could explain what naturalism is.
Naturalism is a system of belief which excludes God, where you consider only the natural aspects of creation, and the theistic aspect of naturalism would be pantheism, which simply means that there is no God transcendent to creation who exists and who brought everything into existence out of nothing, but rather God is identified with the material world. So pantheism simply means that everything is God. But modernism itself, the modernists who virtually control virtually every Catholic seminary in the world that I know of, the modernists have this naturalistic concept of religion, and many of them are actually pantheists. That is to say, they identify God with the universe. So from the point of view of the influence of Freemasonry, we could say that the anarchy that you find, the socialism and the anarchy, would be the political manifestation of Masonic ideology, and the modernism, the naturalism, the pantheism that we find so dominant today would be a kind of theological manifestation of Masonic religious principle.
Mm-hmm. How do you reconcile, Father Kelly, this profound change in attitude toward Freemasonry? We have, for instance, a picture of John Paul II receiving members of the B'nai B'rith Lodge. We have the new Code of Canon Law, which drops any reference to Masonry. How could this be? After 22 years of condemnation, now suddenly it's tolerated, it's okay. In this country, at least, many churchmen are active Masons, and many bishops okay their parishioners and their subjects to become Masons.
I think it's a question of seeing the reform in the context of history. What is the nature of this reform that has taken place? Is it a question simply of a temporary lapse into to unorthodoxy? Is it maybe a kind of Protestant Reformation from within, a temporary setback, or whatever it may be? In my own personal opinion, and I've expressed this opinion before, I personally am of the opinion that we are living in the age of the great apostasy. The apostasy that took place at the time of the Protestant Reformation, the apostasy that we saw in the time of the French Revolution, these were sort of local, specific, and limited. But the apostasy that we see in the church today is a kind of a general thing. It's virtually any place you go, and every place you go, you find this deterioration of the Catholic faith. You find the destruction of orthodoxy. So personally, in my own opinion, I think that we are living in the age of the great apostasy. And I think that, as Leo XIII points out, there is this great struggle between the forces of God and the forces of Satan, between the city of God and the city of man. And that in modern times, this struggle is manifested most especially by the organization that you find in Masonry. That Masonry is the chief, most effective, most powerful instrument of Satan in its attack upon the church. And that it is, to a great extent, responsible for the deterioration that has taken place, for the apostasy that has taken place. And then, quite logically, if that is the case, if modernists adopt Masonic ideas of God and of morality and of truth, of doctrine, and so forth and so on, then quite obviously there would be a lessening of the opposition to membership in Masonry, also reflected by the ecumenical spirit. Right. You know,
and that's why Masonry is succeeding in many ways, because while there's roughly 4 million members, their influence is much greater than that. They've influenced the decisions of the Supreme Court. They've influenced our whole culture today because they can work underground. They have a lot of front groups. They have people who are Masons. According to Masonic law, you can't tell some man's a Mason unless he admits that he's a Mason. Mm-hmm. Jack Kemp's, former Congressman Jack Kemp's a case in point. Jack Kemp never has membership in Masonry in his biography, but he was awarded the 33rd degree up in Massachusetts several years ago. He approached President Reagan, asked if he would become a Mason as directed by the Grand Lodge in New York. That was turned down, and later in 1988, Ronald Reagan did come into Masonry. But unless you knew this behind it, you'd never know it from Jack Kemp that he was a Mason. And the same with many, many other people. So when we say that there are no Masons on the court now that Thurgood Marshall is gone, that's because nobody questions them on that. That's never asked. All they ask on the court when they're getting the nominee is what's your stand on abortion. They don't care what else you think, you know. Mm-hmm.
What about Masonry and the New World Order? Franklin Roosevelt, who was a very prominent Mason in the 1930s, I believe, put the phrase Novus Ordo Seclorum on the back of the dollar bill, New World Order. Is that a Masonic goal? Like we see this all the time in the papers, New World Order, New World Order.
Like the magazine, The New Age.
Yeah, yeah. Sure it is. That's the whole idea. The whole idea is to remake society in a way different from God intended it to be. We only have a second left, and maybe we'll just end with this little quotation from Leo XIII's encyclical on Masonry, says, "The race of man, after its miserable fall from God, the creator and the giver of heavenly gifts, through the envy of the devil, separated into two diverse and opposite parts, of which the one steadfastly contends for the truth and virtue, the other for those things which are contrary to virtue and the truth. At every period of time, each has been in conflict with the other with a variety and multiplicity of weapons and of warfare, although not always with equal ardor and assault. At this period, however, the partisans of evil seem to be combining together and to be struggling with united vehemence, led on or assisted by that strongly organized and widespread association called the Freemasons."
You've been watching what Catholics believe.